Power doesn't begin with domination. It begins with observation. The weak speak first. The powerful listen. In every room, in every argument, in every confrontation between predator and prey, there's always one person who stays quiet longer than they should. They're not frozen. They're recording. Every glance, every word, every nervous shift becomes data stored deep within their mind. This is where power is born, not from strength, but from patience. Dark intelligence is the art of knowing what others reveal without meaning to. The world calls it manipulation. The wise call it preparation. The first law of power is simple. The one who reacts first loses. And yet, most people can't help themselves. They rush to defend, to argue, to prove a point, revealing their insecurities like open wounds. The quiet one, the listener, simply watches. They collect weaknesses disguised as words. That's how silent wars begin, not with a weapon, but with a gaze. In the age of noise, silence feels unnatural. We equate it with submission, with defeat. But the truth is far more dangerous. Silence is an ambush. It's a trap set by those who understand human nature too well. The man who speaks least in a meeting often knows the most. The lover who stays calm during a fight isn't always the one surrendering. Sometimes they're calculating your emotional leverage. The friend who doesn't respond to an insult isn't being kind. They're memorizing the rhythm of your anger, preparing to use it later. Every moment of restraint adds power to the observer's arsenal, because when you stop reacting, you stop bleeding energy. That's what he learned. The man who once believed that silence was weakness. For years, he spoke to be heard, fought to be respected, shouted to be understood, and every time he lost, not because he was wrong, but because he was predictable. His enemies didn't need to defeat him. They only had to trigger him. Until one day, he stopped talking. He watched. He waited. He let others expose their patterns, who they trusted, who they feared, what they lied about when no one was listening. And in that silence, he found something terrifyingly powerful: clarity. The world no longer blurred with noise. Every tone, every hesitation became a signal. People told him their secrets without realizing it. That's when he understood. Silence was not the absence of power. It was the breeding ground for it. You see, the human mind hates silence. When words stop, thoughts scream. And when you make someone sit in that quiet long enough, they reveal more than they ever intended. It's not magic. It's psychology. The one who controls the silence controls the truth. But silence comes with a cost. Once you master it, you can never return to the comfort of noise. You start hearing what others can't: the motives beneath compliments, the guilt behind laughter, the tremor in someone's voice when they lie. And that's where the descent begins. Because once you can read people, you start to test them. You start to shape them. He learned to use silence as both shield and sword, protecting himself while cutting through others' illusions. Every pause became a question. Every unanswered question, a mirror. And soon, he realized something chilling. Power wasn't about control. It was about understanding the weakness in control itself. When you no longer need to speak, you've already won half the war. But the other half, that's where the true danger lies. Because once you master silence, the next question arises: what mask will you wear when you finally decide to speak? He once believed silence made him powerful, but silence alone was never enough. Power to survive must eventually be seen. The world doesn't bow to those who are strong. It bows to those who appear untouchable. And so begins the second law of dark intelligence. Control is theater. The audience doesn't need to know what happens behind the curtain. They only need to believe the actor on the stage never falters. Every human wears two faces, the one for the world and the one they pray no one ever sees. The first is polished, crafted from composure, charm, and confidence. The second is trembling, built from insecurity, envy, and fear. Most people spend their lives trying to hide the second face, but the ones who master power, they learn to weaponize it. He began studying the art of performance, not in theaters, but in people. He watched how a confident smile could silence a room, how steady eye contact could turn doubt into belief, how pretending to understand could make others think you already did. Control isn't real. It's an illusion reinforced by how convincingly you can project certainty. Even kings, dictators, and CEOs rule not because they control everything, but because they look like they do. And that's what he learned to build, the mask. At first, it was subtle. A straighter posture, a colder tone, a habit of waiting 2 seconds before responding, long enough to make others question their own words. He realized that power isn't about what you say. It's about what others feel when you say nothing. They fill your silence with their assumptions, and those assumptions become your armor. Soon, his reputation grew on whispers. People began saying, "He's always calm. Nothing shakes him." They didn't know he was shaking inside, rehearsing every movement, every word, every breath like an actor afraid to break character. But the lie worked. Doors began opening. Opportunities appeared. People deferred to him, not because he forced them to, but because they feared interrupting his calm. And yet power gained through performance comes with a poison. The more he wore the mask, the harder it became to take off. He started to forget who he was before he learned how to pretend. The mask protected him, but it also imprisoned him. Behind it, his real face began to wither, unseen and unheard. He laughed less. He trusted less. He loved less. Because every moment of honesty felt like weakness, and weakness, he believed, was fatal. Late at night, when the world slept, he'd stare into the mirror and wonder if the reflection still belonged to him. The calm eyes looking back weren't filled with confidence. They were hollow. He had won respect, admiration, even fear. But he had lost something more vital, truth. That's the paradox of control. Once you master it, you realize it was never real. It's not about strength. It's about others' belief in your strength. And belief is fragile. One crack, one moment of vulnerability, and the illusion begins to fade. He began to notice it, the small fractures in the mask, a tremor in his voice when he lied, a look of exhaustion mistaken for arrogance, a smile too calculated to be human, but by then it was too late. People no longer saw him. They only saw the image he built. He had become a myth inside his own life, and myths, once created, demand constant worship. The moment you stop feeding them, they turn on you. So he kept wearing the mask, day after day, until even he couldn't tell where the performance ended. The mask became his truth, until he forgot where the lie ended. And yet, beneath that mask, something else was awakening. Something patient. Something silent. The part of him that no longer wanted to appear powerful, but to become power itself. Transition to Chapter 3. The Law of Invisible Moves. Because the true masters of control don't show power. They move unseen and let others call it destiny. Control had given him a mask. But masks, no matter how perfect, always attract attention. And attention is the enemy of power. He began to understand a deeper law, one whispered only among the truly dangerous. True power never announces itself. It moves quietly, shaping events while pretending to be shaped by them. Those who seek to prove their dominance expose their strategy. Those who remain unseen write the script of reality itself. He started small, withdrawing from open confrontation, allowing others to believe they had outsmarted him. He nodded when others gloated, agreed when they mocked, and smiled when they thought he was losing. But inside he was taking notes. Every insult became a coordinate, every betrayal a map. He realized that in the grand chessboard of life, the loud players are the pawns, the quiet ones, the ones you barely notice. They are the architects of the game. Power, he learned, thrives in misdirection. If people believe you're harmless, they lower their defenses. If they think you're predictable, they reveal their plans before you even ask. So he became what they needed him to be: simple, trustworthy, unthreatening. The perfect shadow in plain sight. In meetings, he asked questions he already knew the answers to. In arguments, he agreed too easily, forcing his rivals to over-explain their reasoning. In silence, he learned how every tone, pause, and hesitation could expose someone's deepest fear. He had become invisible, not by disappearing, but by blending perfectly into the noise. That's the essence of dark intelligence, the power to move pieces without touching the board. He never issued commands. He planted ideas. He never demanded loyalty. He made people want to prove their worth. He never took revenge. He allowed time and ego to do it for him. Soon, people began acting in ways that benefited him without realizing why. They defended his name in his absence. They made decisions that aligned with his plans, believing they were their own. And when outcomes unfolded, he stood quietly among them, expressionless, as if fate had simply favored him. But invisible power requires restraint, and restraint demands detachment. He couldn't afford emotional ties because emotions expose patterns. He couldn't afford honesty because honesty limits control. The price of invisibility is isolation. When you become a ghost in your own story, who are you performing for anymore? He sometimes wondered if anyone saw him, the real him, beneath the layers of manipulation and strategy. But then he'd remind himself, visibility is vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury he'd buried long ago. There was a strange beauty in his detachment. He could predict people with surgical precision. He knew when a friend would lie before the lie left their lips. He could sense when ambition would fracture loyalty. It was intoxicating, like playing a game only he understood. But games have endings, and even perfect moves leave trails. The more invisible he became, the more people projected their fears onto him. Some began to suspect his calm wasn't innocence. It was orchestration. And suspicion, once planted, grows like a poison. He had won countless invisible wars, but each victory left him emptier, as if the silence he once used to dominate had begun to consume him from within. Still, he couldn't stop. Manipulation had become his instinct. Even kindness, when he offered it, came with calculation. He was no longer pretending to control the game. The game had become his nature. By the time they realized the game had begun, he had already won. But what he didn't realize was this: every strategist eventually meets someone who refuses to play. And when the game stops, when silence meets silence, even the master must face what lies beneath the strategy. Fear, the oldest instrument of control, the first language of power. Long before laws, armies, or kings, humanity was ruled by what it could not name, the dark pulse that makes the body tremble and the mind obey. He had mastered silence, disguise, and invisible manipulation. But he soon discovered that these were merely tools. The true core of dark intelligence was something deeper: the ability to shape fear itself. He once believed fear was a weakness, something to eliminate. Now he saw it for what it truly was: a resource. Raw, primal, and infinitely renewable. Every human being fears something: rejection, failure, loneliness, death. You don't need to destroy those fears to rule people. You simply need to redirect them. He began observing this truth everywhere. The politician who doesn't inspire love but fear of chaos. The preacher who doesn't promise heaven but warns of hell. The lover who doesn't offer peace but makes their absence unbearable. Control isn't about being loved. It's about being needed when the world feels dangerous. That's how empires are built, and that's how they are maintained. He realized that if people feared losing him more than they feared his presence, they would never leave. So he stopped fighting fear. He became it. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he let his silence imply what his words never would. He made others imagine the consequences of disappointing him. And the imagination, he discovered, is far more terrifying than reality. People began to move carefully around him, weighing every word. They justified his coldness as discipline, his detachment as strength. They told themselves they respected him, but it wasn't respect. It was submission dressed as admiration, Fear had become his invisible currency. He could feel it in the air when he entered a room. The shift in tone, the sudden politeness, the stiffness in laughter. No one wanted to be on his wrong side, and so no one was honest with him anymore. That was the paradox. The more power fear gave him, the further it pushed him from truth. He no longer knew who spoke sincerely or who simply obeyed. He ruled a world of puppets, but every string led back to his own loneliness. Yet he couldn't stop. Fear worked too well. It got results. It built alliances. It silenced rebellion before it began. He told himself he wasn't cruel. He was merely efficient. He didn't torture people with terror. He gave their fear direction. He became their center, the one constant in an unpredictable world. He didn't remove their fear. He made himself the only one who could protect them from it. That was his genius and his curse. Because when people follow you out of fear, they never truly love you. They wait. They wait for the moment your control falters. They wait for the whisper of weakness, the first sign that the monster bleeds like they do. And when that moment comes, when the fear fades, obedience turns to vengeance. He began to feel it. The shift in the air, the quiet stares, the tension he could no longer explain away. Fear had built his empire, but now it was building its rebellion. He had redirected it too well, and beneath all his mastery, a question began to haunt him. What happens when the one who controls fear finally begins to feel it? The silence that once gave him power now echoed with paranoia. The faces that once admired him looked sharper, hungrier, less trusting. He started seeing shadows even in the light. Because when fear consumes others, it serves you. But when it consumes you, it ends you. Fear had built his empire, but even fear decays. It corrodes the same walls it once protected. He had kept everyone obedient, but obedience without trust is only borrowed time, and time, as always, collects its debt. He began to notice it first in silence. Not his silence, theirs. The quiet that lingered too long after he spoke. The hesitant glances that never met his eyes. The pauses that carried more meaning than words ever could. Something in the air had shifted. Fear was no longer submission. It had evolved into calculation. The very skill he once taught others, observation, patience, manipulation, was now being used against him. He should have seen it coming. Every alliance he ever formed was built on utility, not affection. They admired his control, his vision, his ability to bend reality in his favor. But admiration fades the moment people begin to believe they can do it better themselves. He had always known that loyalty was conditional. Yet he had underestimated how quickly conditions change when opportunity knocks. They had learned from him how to pretend, how to wait, how to strike only when the outcome was guaranteed. He had raised them as disciples of his own philosophy, and like all true students, they eventually outgrew the need for their master. It began with whispers, small, strategic acts of defiance masked as mistakes. A message delayed, a promise half kept, a meeting rescheduled for reasons that made too much sense. Each piece of the pattern was harmless alone, but together they formed a quiet rebellion. Still, he dismissed it. He told himself it was paranoia, the cost of power, the echo of control slipping through his fingers. He convinced himself that fear was enough to keep them in line. He forgot that fear doesn't eliminate ambition, it only buries it. And buried things, given time, always find a way to grow back. The betrayal came not in the chaos of battle or the heat of confrontation. It came with a smile, a handshake, a shared drink under the illusion of brotherhood. He didn't see the knife, not because it was hidden, but because it was held by someone he once trusted blindly. The strike wasn't physical. It was quieter, cleaner, far more devastating. A strategic leak of information, a deliberate misstep that exposed his vulnerabilities to the very forces he had manipulated. His empire didn't collapse overnight. It rotted from within. The people he once controlled began to move without his command. The structures he built to keep power concentrated now worked to exclude him. He had designed a system so efficient, it no longer needed him to function. That was the ultimate betrayal. Not the knife in the back, but the realization that the world he shaped had learned to operate without its creator. He wasn't destroyed by hatred. He was replaced by imitation. And as he watched everything he built being repurposed by those who once followed him, he finally understood. Betrayal isn't an act of evil. It's a natural consequence of control. Because when people are denied freedom long enough, they eventually learn to steal it. And when the knife finally came, it didn't come from an enemy, but from someone who once called him brother. The silence after that moment was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of recognition. He realized he had never truly been betrayed. He had simply been outplayed by his own reflection. Betrayal has a strange way of purifying what's left of a man. For a moment after the knife of deception twists and the dust of control settles, there is silence. A silence so absolute it almost feels holy. But beneath that stillness, something darker stirs, the hunger for restoration. Not for redemption, but for control. He told himself he wanted to rebuild, but in truth he wanted to own again. He wanted to feel the pulse of fear return in others' eyes, to sense the invisible strings tightening under his fingers. That's the curse of power. Once you've bent reality to your will, you can't stand to see it disobey. At first, he believed he was regaining composure. He began to plan again, quietly, methodically. He charted new alliances, calculated new moves, learned from the very betrayals that had undone him. But the more he planned, the less human he became. He no longer saw people, only leverage. Every word, every gesture, every tear, everything became a potential move in the great game of dominance. He told himself this was evolution, wisdom gained from pain. Yet deep down, something inside him had already begun to fracture. Power, once tasted, rewires the mind. It convinces you that everything, love, loyalty, kindness, is transactional. He could no longer tell the difference between genuine emotion and manipulation. Every kindness looked like deceit waiting for its moment. Every confession sounded like a trap disguised as truth. He stopped sleeping. Night after night, he sat by the window of his high apartment, watching the city flicker beneath him like a network of veins pulsing with ambition. He saw himself in every light, a reflection of hunger disguised as civilization, and in that sleepless clarity, obsession took root. He no longer wanted victory. Victory had limits. It ended when the enemy fell. But control had no end. Control could be eternal if maintained, renewed, protected. It wasn't the results that intoxicated him. It was the act of deciding outcomes, the invisible power to make or unmake another person's reality. He became his own prisoner, a king trapped in a fortress built from paranoia and memory. He replayed every betrayal, every smirk, every look of pity. In each he found not pain, but purpose. He began to believe that suffering was the necessary fuel for greatness, that only those who endure chaos deserve to rule it. His reflection in the mirror no longer looked back. It watched. Its eyes were sharper, colder, detached. He studied himself as if analyzing an opponent. When did the strategist become the experiment? When did survival turn into obsession? The lines blurred until there was no difference. He wasn't chasing power anymore. He was chasing the feeling of power. The surge that made him feel immortal, untouchable, godlike. But in that pursuit, something essential died. His reason. The same intelligence that once made him dangerous now made him delusional. He started seeing enemies in every reflection, hearing betrayal in every silence. The empire had fallen long ago, but in his mind, the war still raged. And in war, nothing grows except madness. One night, as the rain hammered against the glass, he finally whispered to his reflection, "Who are you without control?" The mirror didn't answer, it only cracked. A fine line spreading like a wound, dividing his face into two. The man he was, and the thing he had become. He didn't chase victory anymore. He chased the feeling of control. And that's what destroyed him. Control had turned into obsession. And obsession, once refined, seeks a new outlet. Someone to shape, someone to test. After all, power is meaningless without an audience to bend beneath it. He told himself he wasn't manipulating her. He was studying her, observing how emotion could be sculpted like clay. She entered his life not as a threat but as a curiosity, a woman untouched by the cold logic that consumed him. She spoke of empathy, of trust, of things he had long filed away as weaknesses. But in her warmth, he saw something far more valuable than innocence. He saw leverage. Every person, he believed, carried a hidden lever, that single, unguarded emotion that defines them. For some, it's guilt. For others, the hunger to be loved or the terror of being forgotten. And once you find that lever, you don't need force. You only need patience. He began with small things, gentle questions, casual observations. He noticed how her eyes dimmed when she spoke about her father, how her tone shifted when she mentioned trust, how she smiled a little too brightly when masking disappointment. These weren't just traits. They were entry points, cracks in the armor of the human soul. He took mental notes as if she were a case study. He told her what she needed to hear, mirrored her fears, and slowly became the reflection of her ideal. She began to depend on his calmness, the quiet certainty he carried. And in that dependence, he found control. Not through force, not through deception, but through emotional precision. He didn't manipulate her feelings directly. He simply positioned himself as the answer to them. That's the cruel beauty of dark intelligence. You don't destroy people. You teach them to destroy themselves while believing it's their choice. He would plant ideas like seeds, buried under the soil of affection. Are you sure they understand you? Sometimes people take advantage of kindness. You give too much of yourself, people might not value that. Each sentence was harmless alone, but together they rewired her trust. The world became sharper, colder, and the only place she felt safe was beside him, the very architect of her confusion. He watched it unfold with detached fascination. How quickly warmth can turn to dependence. How easily self-doubt can become devotion. She didn't realize she was slipping. Neither did he, not at first. For a moment he felt something dangerously close to care. But care for him had always been another form of control. He mistook it for mastery, a perfect demonstration of his influence, until the night she looked at him with tears, not fear. And in her trembling voice she whispered, "I finally understand you. You only love the parts of people you can command." Something inside him flinched, not from guilt, but recognition. Because she was right. He had never loved anyone. He had only loved the feeling of being necessary. The next morning, she was gone. No argument, no closure, just silence, the one sound he could no longer bear. For days, he waited for her to return. But what haunted him most wasn't her absence. It was the mirror she left behind, the one that forced him to see that his greatest weapon was no longer strategy or fear. It was loneliness. He didn't break her mind, he simply held up a mirror and let her destroy herself. When she left, the silence did not fade. It grew. It spread through the rooms he once ruled like an invisible fog, thick and heavy, pressing down on every surface, every thought. The echoes of control that once defined him had vanished. No footsteps, no voices, no audience. Only the weight of his own reflection, the ghost of a man who had mistaken dominance for meaning. He had achieved everything he once believed mattered. Power, influence, a reputation built on fear and respect. People still spoke his name, still obeyed his word, still flinched when he entered a room. Yet beneath the surface of that dominance lay a truth he could no longer avoid. He was utterly alone. Every gain, he realized, demands a sacrifice. His victories had cost him trust. His calculations had cost him love. And his throne, the very symbol of his success, had cost him himself. He once thought loneliness was a weakness, a flaw of the unguarded. Now he saw it for what it truly was, the tax of ambition. The higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes, until you start gasping not for oxygen, but for connection. But when you've built an empire on fear, no one dares to breathe near you. He sat at the long marble table that stretched like a scar through his chamber. The surface reflected his face, tired, hollow, and unrecognizable. He had become a monument to his own ideology, Even his triumphs looked small beneath the shadow of what they had cost. Outside, the city pulsed like a living organism, billions of minds moving, chasing, consuming. He had once believed he could orchestrate that rhythm. Now he understood. No one controls the storm. They only ride it until it throws them off. He thought of her, not with regret, but with a kind of mourning for something nameless. Perhaps it wasn't her he missed, but the version of himself that existed when she looked at him without fear. Back then, he was still human enough to be seen. He had become untouchable, and therefore invisible. Power isolates not because people fear you, but because they finally see you. They see the emptiness behind your smile, the machinery behind your charm. They see that every act of kindness is calculated, every moment of empathy rehearsed. And once they see that, they withdraw. Not out of hatred, but out of instinct. The throne had given him everything the world could measure, and taken everything it could not. He could command armies, but not affection. He could silence nations, but not his thoughts. And in that imbalance, he began to fracture. Late one night, he found himself standing before the same mirror he had shattered once before. The crack still ran through it, dividing his reflection in two. He placed his hand on the glass, tracing the fracture line. It felt cold, almost alive. For a fleeting second, he imagined another version of himself on the other side, a version that had chosen differently, that had valued love over control, truth over fear. That man was still smiling, still alive. Still human, but reflections are cruel teachers. They show what could have been, not what remains. As dawn crept through the window, the golden light washed over the empty chamber. It illuminated the throne, magnificent, towering, but untouched. He stared at it, realizing it was not a seat of power. It was a prison built from victory. He had ruled everything, and lost the only thing that could not be conquered: peace. In the end, he ruled everything, except his own mind. Power had never frightened him. Not the kind he wielded, nor the kind he faced. But as the days blurred into endless nights, and silence became his only company, something new began to creep in. Doubt. Not the logical, calculated kind he could reason away, but a whispering presence that moved through the corridors of his mind like smoke. He had built a world designed on control. And control is a structure that cannot tolerate uncertainty. But the higher he climbed, the less real anything began to feel. The faces around him, those few who remained, smiled too easily, agreed too quickly, obeyed too perfectly. It should have pleased him. Instead, it terrified him, because deep down, he no longer believed any of it was real. He watched them carefully, the advisors, the servants, the ones who still claimed loyalty. Every glance became a signal, every silence a plot, every act of service a strategy. He had once mastered the art of observation. Now it mastered him. He began to see patterns where there were none. Coded phrases in casual conversations, betrayal hidden behind routine. He replayed words in his head until they lost meaning. He analyzed gestures, tones, and pauses until every human interaction became an equation of suspicion. That was the final stage of dark intelligence, when perception becomes poison. He had always believed knowledge was power. But now, every new realization brought pain. Every insight revealed another shadow. His mind, once his sharpest weapon, had turned inward, dissecting itself. He was no longer calculating outcomes. He was hunting ghosts. The faces of those he had manipulated began to return in his dreams. Not accusing, not vengeful, simply watching. Their eyes followed him through hallways, through mirrors, through the cracks of his waking thoughts. He told himself they were hallucinations, consequences of isolation and insomnia. But part of him knew better. They were not ghosts of the dead. They were ghosts of the living. The fragments of trust he had destroyed in others now haunting him from within. He saw her too, the woman he once molded with words and silence. Sometimes her reflection appeared in the mirror beside his own, smiling sadly as if to say, "You finally understand." But he didn't want understanding. He wanted peace. And peace is the one thing no strategist can negotiate. His empire, though still standing, had become a stage without an audience. He sat upon his throne, surrounded by gold, wisdom, and silence, and felt nothing. The same walls that once symbolized his supremacy now closed in like a cage. He had built a perfect design, airtight, efficient, and self-sustaining, but he had forgotten one crucial flaw. Every architect eventually becomes trapped inside his own creation. The paranoia deepened. He stopped eating with others, fearing the food was laced. He ordered mirrors covered, afraid of what might look back. He dismissed guards, believing their eyes followed him too long. And yet when the halls finally emptied, he was terrified of the quiet, because in the silence, the ghosts spoke. Not with words, but with memories. They replayed the choices he made, the betrayals he engineered, the faces he erased in pursuit of dominance. Each one a reminder that the hunter and the hunted were never different, only phases of the same obsession. He began to realize that his brilliance had not saved him. It had sealed him. The same intelligence that built his empire was the very thing dismantling his sanity, piece by piece. He had once believed he could predict every move, every outcome, every betrayal. But there was one game he could never master, the one between himself and his own mind. He began seeing ghosts in every loyal face until he became one himself. In the end, it wasn't the ghosts that destroyed him. It was the mirror. Not the one made of glass, but the invisible one that life eventually holds before every soul that dares to chase absolute power. For years, he believed darkness was something external, a tool to be used, a force to be mastered. But power, in its final form, has no opponent. It leaves you alone with one truth: the enemy was always within. He sat in the same room where it all began, surrounded by relics of his victories, maps of conquered markets, letters from powerful allies, artifacts of ambition. They no longer looked like trophies. They looked like confessions. Every object carried the echo of a manipulation, a compromise, a life bent to his will. He once thought these were the marks of greatness. Now they were tombstones of the person he used to be. For the first time, he didn't analyze or calculate. He just looked. And what he saw wasn't evil, not in the way stories describe it. It was emptiness wearing intelligence as a mask. The same sharpness that had given him strength had stripped him of everything that made that strength matter. Power, he realized, had never been about control. Control was only the symptom, the addiction that kept him from facing what he truly feared: powerlessness. He had built an empire not because he wanted to rule others, but because he was terrified of being ruled by his own insecurities. And that terror, disguised as ambition, had guided every choice, every victory, every sin. He finally understood what the philosophers meant when they said, "Conquer yourself, and the world cannot touch you." But self-conquest, he knew now, was not triumph. It was surrender. It meant acknowledging the monster inside, not destroying it, but understanding it. Because darkness is not the opposite of light. It's the truth that light refuses to admit. He walked toward the old desk where his notes still lay. Thoughts on psychology, power, manipulation. Words written in certainty by a man who believed he had unlocked the mind of humanity. Now those same words looked like the desperate scribblings of someone trying to make sense of his own reflection. He picked up the final page, the one he never finished, and read the last line he had written years ago. Control others and you'll rule for a day. Control yourself and you'll rule forever. He smiled, not with pride, but with something softer: acceptance. The kind that only comes after losing everything that once defined you. He took a pen and added one final sentence beneath it. But to rule yourself, you must first meet the part of you that doesn't want to be ruled. And in that line, the circle closed. The lessons, the betrayals, the manipulations, all of it had been a mirror, reflecting not his superiority, but his blindness. He had never been teaching others how to gain power. He had been teaching himself what it meant to be consumed by it. The rain began to fall outside, steady and rhythmic. He closed the book slowly, feeling its weight, not in his hands, but in his soul. It was no longer a record of conquest, but a confession of transformation. And when he finally closed the book, he realized it was never about them. The lesson had always been about him. He rose from his chair and turned toward the window. The city below glimmered like a million shifting thoughts, each light a story of hunger, fear, and desire. He didn't smile or frown. He simply understood. Power had not destroyed him. It had revealed him, and as dawn broke over the skyline, he whispered the last forbidden truth. Dark intelligence isn't the art of control. It's the courage to look into the abyss and recognize your own reflection.